We're back. Thanks for waiting a bit for this 12th episode of this series on mechanics. Throughout this series, we've seen how the dimension of mass can be called upon to better understand space and time, and their combination, motion. We've learned to formalize this connection by introducing mechanical quantities or mass-carrying quantities, particularly the standard ones found on this table. Initially, we focused on pairs, all sorts of pairs. Horizontal pairs providing a mechanical understanding of sizes, lengths, distances. Vertical pairs for time, durations, periods. Diagonal pairs for motions of all sorts. With episodes 9, 10, and 11, we included a third mechanical quantity. When the three quantities were not aligned, we saw that they produced events, space-time points where the regimes from the three pairs of the trio intersect. These events were turning points of the dynamics and provided objective units, regardless of the perspective. It's now time to discuss aligned trios. In this case, the three regimes do not intersect, they are parallel. No more intersection, no more event. Mechanical quantities can be aligned along any direction, but today we will focus on the special case where the three quantities are aligned horizontally, producing lengths. This case provides an ideal framework for a discussion of geometry. The connection between geometry and mechanics dates back to antiquity. Nevertheless, as we will see, mixed models abound, combining some mechanical quantities with geometric parameters, but fully mechanical models are rare. This is rather annoying from a didactic perspective, but it offers many exciting avenues of research. We know since episode 2 that if we have a pair of mechanical quantities on the same line, we get a simple length. Now, if we have a trio of quantities on the same line, we get three lengths. As we will see now, their relative magnitudes are set quite simply by the dimensions of the three quantities. A theory of mechanical geometry is easy to put together, so we'll do that. Using it in practice is more challenging, as we will see later. So a pair gives a simple length. A trio gives us three pairs, all the possible combinations. And if the quantities in the trio are on the same line in the table, from each pair we get a simple length. In the canonical perspective, d as function of t, we get three parallel horizontal lines, one for each length. But can we know which pair corresponds to which line? And what are the relationships between the lines? And how can we interpret these relationships? Let's consider an example. Let's say that the three quantities are a force density psi, a stress or modulus sigma, and a surface tension or stiffness gamma. Each pair corresponds to a simple length. But what is important is that these three lengths are not independent. For instance, the first two lengths depend on the same force density psi. It is actually quite easy to see that this trio is associated with the following relation. The square of the second length is equal to the product of the other two lengths. So if we know two lengths, we know the third one. Any aligned trio is associated with a relationship like this. When the trio is horizontal, the relationship admits a geometric interpretation. For instance, here the square of a length is equal to the product of two others. To facilitate the interpretation, let's call the first length r, the second h, and the third w. This equation could be interpreted as saying that the area of a square of side r is equal to that of a rectangle of height h and width w. And since we are neglecting numerical factors of order 1, the square may as well be a circle, and the rectangle an ellipse. Let's put in some numbers. Here, the force density psi has a value typical of the weight density for a material with density close to that of water. The surface tension also has a value typical in simple fluids, and the modulus of 1 kilopascal could correspond to a soft gel. With these numbers, we can compute the three length scales. In this example, the height is 10,000 times larger than the width. The gap is so large that we couldn't draw the shape to scale. If we recall the formulas for the three lengths, we see that the difference between the height and the width can be reduced by decreasing the height and or increasing the width. Assuming we want to keep the middle length constant, we could keep the values of the force density and surface tension, but vary the stress or modulus sigma. If we decrease the stress, the width will increase and the height will decrease. For instance, this is what we get for a stress of 20 pascals. The three lengths are now much closer, close enough that we can sketch the shapes. If the stress is decreased to 10 pascals, we reach a very special situation, where the three lengths have the same value. If we decrease the stress even further, the shape becomes wider than it is high. That is the length based on surface tension, and stress is now larger than the one based on stress and force density. The third length remains in the middle. Let's try to understand this fact first. Why is it that in all the conditions that we've encountered, the middle line is always the one based on surface tension and force density? When we say that this length is always in the middle between the other two, we mean this on a logarithmic scale. For instance, here the height is 100 times larger, and the width is 100 times smaller. Why? Well, the response is in the identity at the top. Taking the square root, we see that the length on the left is the geometric mean of the two lengths on the right. A quantity is the geometric mean of two terms, precisely when the log of that quantity is the arithmetic mean of the logs of the two others. So this length will always be in the middle. These positions in the kinematic plane are directly related to the positions of the mechanical quantities, aligned in the table. The length based on the quantities at the extremities of the trio will be the one in the middle, between the other two. But it will not always be exactly halfway between the other two. For instance, let's consider this trio where a force replaces the stress. We've got three pairs, and so three simple lengths. As before, these three lengths are connected by a geometric identity. However, this identity is not the same as before. Here, the volume of a sphere or a cube is identical to that of a cylinder, with a circular or square base. Our degree of approximation does not allow the difference to be made. Here again, the identity can be written as a geometric mean, but the terms of the mean now have different weights. The mean length remains in between the other two lengths, but it is twice closer to the length with a weight of 2 than to the other length. So with this trio, the mean length will still be the one built from the extremities of the trio, and this length will be twice closer to the length built from quantities 2 cells apart than from the length built from adjacent quantities. The configuration of the aligned quantities in the mechanical plane dictates the geometric relationship between the associated length scales. For 3 arbitrary mechanical quantities aligned horizontally, the relations between the associated 3 lengths in the kinematic plane can be obtained without difficulty. The value of the time exponent does not matter, since it cancels out when constructing the lengths. The 3 quantities can be on any line from this table. We could call x1, x2, and x3 the space exponents of the 3 mechanical quantities, but we know that only the relative dimensions matter in the ratios, so we can instead introduce the differences in exponents. With these definitions, we can get the general equations of the 3 simple lengths and their geometric relationship. Here again we get a weighted geometric mean, where the length associated with the most distant pair in the mechanical plane ends up in the middle in the kinematic plane. This mean length is closer to the length associated with the second most distant pair in the mechanical plane, and the third pair naturally gives the last length. However, we do not know the exact ordering of the values of these 3 lengths, if they increase from top to bottom, or the other way. To sort out this orientation, let's consider 3 equally spaced quantities. This will simplify a bit the formulas, without loss of generality. If it helps, you can think of the trio we used earlier as an example. A situation like this admits a pretty simple geometric interpretation. We know the side of the square corresponds to the furthest pair. We know this length will be halfway between the 2 others. since it is their geometric mean. But we do not know which one of the two other lengths is larger. They can be visualized with our rectangle. One of the lengths may be said to be the height by definition, while the other is the width. But we do not know if our rectangle is slender or wide. The question can be rephrased by defining an aspect ratio. Whether or not this aspect ratio will be smaller or greater than 1 will tell us which length is bigger. This ratio of two lengths is a dimensionless number. We could of course have defined it the other way around. Like the simple dimensionless numbers we've seen before, this number is defined modulo an overall power. But unlike simple dimensionless numbers, this one does not depend on any variable. It can be written solely from the constant mechanical parameters, Q1, Q2, and Q3. This kind of dimensionless number is what we will call an index. Numbers like this one will take an increasingly dominant role in future episodes, but we're not there yet. Let's revert to the geometric factors for a moment. In the kinematic plane, the vertical axis does not yet have an orientation. It could be increasing, up or down, we do not know. So we can actually place the other two lengths any way we want, this way or that way. Both ways are valid as long as the axis has no direction. We have three lengths that could serve as units of the vertical size axis. We have three competing units. This is a situation we have not encountered before. Let's try all three possibilities. If we use the top length as unit, then the size of the bottom length in this unit is just our dimensionless aspect ratio, the index n. What about the middle length? Time to use the identity at the top. With this geometric relation, we can write the middle length from the other two. When scaled by the top length, the middle length is just the square root of the index. All three lengths are powers of the index. If instead we use the bottom length as unit, or the middle one, we similarly get coordinates given by simple powers of the index. With any one of these three competing systems of units, we can see that the orientation of the size axis will depend on the value of n. If n is greater than 1, then the square root of n will be greater than 1, and so the axis will be pointing downward. Conversely, it will be pointing upward if n is smaller than 1. We will say that any aligned trio of mechanical quantities is dual. We can represent this duality like this by flipping the direction of the axis, or by keeping the same direction, but switching the coordinates. In the simplest cases, this duality will admit geometric interpretations, like the difference between slender and wide. Usually it will be more subtle, but always insightful. Before moving on to the more common, but more challenging cases, let's keep it simple as long as possible, and consider an example where a horizontally aligned trio is used in the hope of grasping the apparent geometry of an object influenced by mechanics. Basically, we saw in episode 2 how mechanics could be used to understand size, and we'll now try to understand shape, the apparent geometry of an object, its volume, its height, its width, etc. We'll consider the shape of cells that spread on solid substrates. The animal cells are here imaged with fluorescence, labeling the actin cytoskeleton in green and the nucleus in blue. When the same type of cell is put on a soft or stiff substrate, its shape varies significantly. On a soft substrate, the area of contact is smaller, as seen in the upper panels, and the cell is higher and rounder, as seen on the side view at the bottom. This fact has been qualitatively known for many years, but its quantification remains the source of active research. The images here are from a great study by Guo and co-workers, which we'll use to guide our investigation of the mechanical underpinning of these geometric changes. To a first approximation, we'll assume that the cells are roughly cylindrical, having two similar dimensions in the plane of the substrate, and a different one, the height, perpendicular to it. We want to know how the shape and size of these cylinders depend on the mechanical properties of the cells and their environment. In particular, we want to relate the slenderness to the so-called stiffness of the substrate. Biomechanics is still a burgeoning field, so terms are used a bit liberally. What is meant by stiffness in this context is not what is tabulated here. It is not measured in kilogram per square second, nor in Newton per meter, nor in joule per square meter. It is rather an elastic modulus, what we generically call a stress. Its standard unit is the Pascal, which is a kilogram per meter per square second. That is a Newton per square meter, or a joule per cubic meter, or a watt second per cubic meter, etc. The dimensions are what really matters. The shape is influenced by the elastic modulus of the substrate. This is the first mechanical quantity we start with. For instance, here is the area of contact for substrates with different values of elastic modulus, with an example at low elasticity, around 1 kilopascal, and one at an elasticity 10 times greater. Although the in-plane shape of the cell may vary from soft to stiff substrates, we can define an average radius of contact. We'll call this geometric metric L1. We can plot this average radius as a function of the elastic modulus of the substrate. The author of this study also measured the cell volume. Note that the volume omega is here represented with a linear scale. A straight line in such semi-logarithmic, or ln-log plot, corresponds to a logarithmic variation. We'll talk a lot more about this in a future episode. The only thing we need to know now is that a logarithmic variation is quite weak. If represented in log scale, the volume only varies slightly with the elastic modulus of the substrate. We could try to fit a power law, but its exponent would need to be close to zero. For instance, what is represented here is a volume scaling as the power minus 1/8 of the modulus. Small indeed. To compare this variation with that of the average contact radius, we should translate the volume into a length scale. To do this, we can define an average bulk radius. We can think of it as the radius of a ball of volume omega. We have the average contact radius L1 and this average bulk radius L2, and we can now compare their behavior. The radius of contact L1 does seem to be much more sensitive to the elasticity of the substrate than the bulk radius L2. From these two length scales, we can define a third, which is the average height of the cells. That is the volume divided by the contact area. So based on the two previous definitions, this height is related to the ratio between the cube of the bulk radius and the square of the contact radius. We don't have a habit of bothering with numerical factors, so we'll just absorb them with the approximate equality. We can then plot this average height. We now have three length scales connected by a geometric identity of a cylindrical type. A volume is given by an area multiplied by a height. The purpose of a mechanical model is to explain this particular shape by connecting the three lengths to underlying mechanical quantities. The data do suggest that the elastic modulus of the substrate is a good place to start. However, the elastic modulus influencing the cell shape cannot solely be that of the substrate, at least not on this vast range, extending from soft gels to stiff glass. There seems to be a threshold above which the shape does not change with increasing elasticity of the substrate. This threshold is usually understood as connected to the elasticity of the cells themselves. Although properly taking this effect into account would be interesting, for today we can focus on substrates softer than this limit. Then, the behavior of the cells can be further separated in two ranges of substrate elasticity. For very soft substrates, the shape does not depend on the elasticity of the substrate. The cells are rather round and do not spread much. If the goal is to build a mechanical model of the geometry based on the elasticity of the substrate, it would manifestly not apply to this soft range. There, the shape of the cells may be connected to surface tension effects, or to other mechanical parameters we do not know. The only data points we are left with are rather sparse, but at least in this intermediate range, the shape does depend on the modulus of the substrate. Can a mechanical model based on three horizontally aligned quantities recover this behavior? Let's recall our hypothesis that the shape of the cells is approximately cylindrical, and that the slenderness or flatness depends on the elastic modulus of the substrate. We know now that this is only true in an intermediate range of elasticity, which we are henceforth focusing on. So we have a geometric identity, and we basically want to replace the arbitrary numerical indices by pairs of mechanical quantities, based on a trio including the substrate modulus, which we'll just call sigma from now on. The trio would be understood as the mechanical origin of the observed geometry. But since we do not know what are the other two mechanical quantities, Q2 and Q3, we have to work backward by inference. A new opportunity for a game of mechanical bingo, but now constrained to a line. First of all, if we restrict our mechanical model to a trio including an elasticity sigma, there is no way for the three associated lengths to all depend on sigma. The length associated with the pair Q2, Q3 will be independent of the substrate modulus. So returning to our three lengths, this means that if we want to explain the variations of the contact radius and height with just three mechanical parameters, we must neglect the weak variations of the bulk radius, that is, of the volume. Although this is rather contrary to the purpose of the cited paper, it is a direct consequence of dimensional analysis if we restrict ourselves to a trio. This is of course a big if, but it is the framework for this episode. Then, the volume and so the bulk radius L2 will depend on Q2 and Q3. According to the geometric identity, this length will always be a geometric mean of the other two. It will always be in the middle. And so the two unknown mechanical quantities, Q2 and Q3, must be on either side of the elastic modulus. Where exactly is the question we want to answer? Recalling the beginning of the episode, we see that we have two kinds of possibilities. One of the additional mechanical quantities must be twice further from the elasticity than the other one, but it can be either on the left or on the right. These two configurations are required to recover the cylindrical identity. But to be more precise, the gaps in dimensions do not have to be exactly 1 and 2. They can be of any size, as long as the proportions are maintained. The dimensional gap x disappears in the geometry, but it remains in the mechanical expressions of the lengths. Just like before, we do not a priori know the full ordering of the three lengths, but we know the bulk radius is in the middle, and of the remaining two which one is the contact radius and which one is the height. The height, for instance, is always constructed from the mechanical quantity closest to the elasticity sigma. We see that the two kinds of cases can be distinguished by the way the height scales with the elastic modulus. In the first case, the elastic modulus tends to decrease the height. The stiffer the substrate, the flatter the cells. This is in contrast to the second case, which does not correspond to observations. So if we seek a mechanical explanation of the shape of these cells, based solely on three mechanical quantities, including the substrate elasticity, we must search for mechanical quantities following this pattern. The dimensional analysis alone does not favor any value of x, but we could start with 1, which would allow us to fit the candidates in the table. The quantity on the right would be a proper stiffness, or a surface tension, or an adhesion energy per unit area, anything with these dimensions. The quantity on the left does not seem to have a standard name, not one we could find in our literature review. Please let us know in the comments if you've encountered it somewhere. At any rate, it's not because it is unnamed that it does not exist. Any mechanical quantity, inside or outside this table, exists only in relation to other quantities, in the ways these relationships manifest themselves in the kinematic plane, as motion, durations, sizes, or here shapes. Although since the beginning of this series we've often assumed the relevance of quantities and derived their outcome, ultimately, the observations dictate their existence. For the time being, let's just call this quantity Q. We then have a complete mechanical model. The height is a kind of elastocapillary or elastoadhesive length, which has been identified in some context relating wetting and elasticity. However, since the other two lengths, involve this less frequent quantity Q. They cannot benefit from any analogy with known phenomena. But anyway, as we said, ultimately, the validity of the model does not depend on connecting it with known physics, but on how it compares with the data. The middle length, the bulk radius, does seem fairly constant, that is independent of the elasticity of the substrate. The contact radius does increase with the elasticity, while the height decreases. But do they follow the prescribed scalings? It's not too bad. From fitting the data, we can then infer a value of the underlying stiffness gamma, and a value for the mysterious Q. Trying to interpret these values by relating them to other processes relevant to cells would be fascinating, but it is a whole research program well beyond the scope of this episode. We derived a bunch of theoretical formulas in the first part of this episode, and the goal here was just to give a concrete example of how to relate a trio of horizontally aligned mechanical quantities to the shape of physical objects. This is what we did here with cells on substrates with different elasticities, where this trio seems to be a candidate worth investigating further. Please let us know in the comments what you think, particularly if you are one of the authors of this study we found so interesting to work with. In this example, the three length scales are connected to what we've called the apparent geometry of the cells, their mean size, and their shape measured by their obvious vertical and horizontal dimensions. From these two lengths, we can define the aspect ratio. As the elastic modulus of the substrate increases, this aspect ratio increases as well. The cells become flatter. However, its value remains relatively moderate, such that we can actually sketch the shape of the cells over this range of variation. If the aspect ratio was significantly smaller or larger, the contact radius or the height would disappear from sight. Mechanical models of an apparent geometry are exciting, but they are by definition restricted to what can be immediately seen, and so to relatively small variations of the aspect ratio. Whether a scaling model of these variations is a good idea is questionable at this stage, but our purpose was not to pass judgment, but to see what a minimal set of mechanical parameters could predict. Mechanical models of an apparent geometry are attractive, but a bit naive. A more profound assessment of the mechanical underpinning of space requires to consider what we may call, for lack of a better name, hidden geometry. We struggled a bit in making this episode, and this chapter in particular. For a few reasons. Although the formal analysis of aligned trios is fairly straightforward, the conclusion of this analysis is conceptually demanding. It challenges a prevalent but limited approach to geometry. For most of us, apparent geometry is geometry. Moreover, on the experimental side, our review of the literature mostly found mechanically incomplete examples. Mostly cases where three lengths are connected, but only one or two are expressed mechanically. Basically, we are progressively leaving the land of established knowledge and entering the more messy but more exciting realm of research. So we hope you'll bear with us. Now then, what is this mysterious hidden geometry we want to talk about? Let's go back to the general formula connecting three horizontally aligned quantities. As before, the weighted geometric mean can be exponentiated. We've seen an example where the three quantities were next to each other, and in that case, the identity could be interpreted fairly easily. We could also interpret a case with gaps of 2 and 1. With the example of cells, we also saw another instance. But what if we have a larger dimensional gap, like 3? What kind of 4-dimensional sketch could we draw now? Mechanically, we would not need to look very far to find a situation like this. For instance, considering a force density, a stress, and an energy would produce such seemingly 4-dimensional relationship. We'll see in the next episode how this trio can be used to understand cratering. Nature has no trouble at all with such higher dimensions. The implicit assumption behind our little sketches from before is to blame for this conundrum. Although sketches like this can help get some intuition for the geometric identity, they are also severely limiting our imagination. Sure, the area of a square can be equal to that of a rectangle, but there are many other ways for this equation to hold. Even if we keep the interpretation of the left-hand side as a square, the right-hand side could be all sorts of things, like two concentric circles with different sizes, or a curved line with a given length and radius of curvature, or a line with another one branching out from it. In general, the relationship is between lengths, not between the area or volume that they may enclose. Take now the cubic identity. It may indeed connect a cube and a cylinder, but this relationship is also found in trees and not in the way you might expect. To a first approximation, the apparent geometry of a tree is cylindrical. So we may think that in the geometric identity, we should find the average radius here and the height there. After all, in a cylindrical shape, the area of the base multiplied by the height gives the volume. If mechanics was always directly connected to the apparent geometry, this is what we would expect. Instead, for trees, another scaling has long been considered, where the cube of the height is connected to the square of the radius and to a third length that is not even on the picture. Such counterintuitive scaling is based on ideas going back to Leonhard Euler. Euler considered the critical force over which a beam, or pole of height h and radius r, would buckle. This force F depends on the elastic modulus sigma of the pole. If trees only grew up to this limit, and the force F was always constant, then the height would be proportional to the square of the radius. However, the force on the column, also called the load, is actually the own weight of the tree, which depends on its mass m and on the acceleration of gravity g. And so the weight depends on the volume omega of the tree. We can group the density ρ and the acceleration of gravity g into a weight density psi, as we've done on many occasions. Then, as discussed before, to a first approximation, trees are cylindrical, and so the volume is estimated by multiplying the square of the radius by the height, neglecting numerical factors as usual. Then, grouping all heights and radii together, we obtain a scaling where the height is proportional to the radius to the power 2/3. The elastic modulus and the density, and so the force density, may vary a bit depending on the species of tree. But if their geometry is indeed governed by this buckling limit, we should observe this scaling. This plot, compiled by McMahon in a seminal 1973 paper, records the observed maximal size of nearly all American species of trees, from the dwarf birch to the giant sequoia. Although the data points are a bit scattered, they do seem to broadly follow a 2/3 power law. In this context, a power law is also referred to as an allometric relation. Here, a length, the height, is proportional to another length, the radius raised to the power 2/3. So necessarily, the dimensions impose that the coefficient of proportionality is the cubic root of a third length. The length used for the straight line on this plot is around 40 kilometers. This length is much larger than the height or radius of even the largest trees, and yet, if we believe this 2/3 scaling, the height, the radius, and this third length are intimately connected. When we solely focus on the apparent geometry of an object, we miss the forest for the trees. Behind any radius, any height, behind any length that we see, there can be hidden lengths, connecting the object to its microscopic constituents, or to the larger world that it is part of. Mechanical geometry is not solely about shape, it is also about structure. The structures inside the tree, and outside of it, those the tree is simply a part of, the forest, the planet, and even beyond. These statements may sound suspiciously New Age, but they are actually a consequence of Euler's scaling. In this mechanical model, the mysterious third length is the ratio of the elastic modulus and the weight density. It is the first kind of simple length we saw in episode 2. Back then we saw that this length was associated with the hydrostatic equilibrium, and that it could be used to estimate the size of planets. For a planet of mean elastic modulus sigma, density ρ, and acceleration of gravity g at its surface, This length gives the order of magnitude of the size of the planet. We did the case of the Earth in episode 2. Then, the mean elastic modulus was around 10 to the 11th pascals, the mean density around 5,000 kilograms per cubic meter, and the acceleration of gravity around 10 meters per square second, giving an order of magnitude for the size of the Earth around 1,000 kilometers. For trees, this length scale gives a similar order of magnitude. The acceleration of gravity is the same. Despite some variations depending on species, the density of wood is smaller than the mean density of the Earth, but the elastic moduli of wood are also significantly smaller than that of our rocky planet. Usually the densest kinds of wood are also those with the highest values of elasticity, so overall, the length built from these factors always tends to be around 1,000 kilometers. In contrast, we've seen that the power law capturing the mean trend of this dataset involves a length around 40 kilometers. 40 kilometers, that's rather significantly different from 1,000 kilometers. Well, not that much actually. If we use 1,000 kilometers, the line is notably off, but if we include a numerical correction delta, setting its value not far from 1 recovers the fitted line. And it is not hard to see that such kind of numerical correction should indeed be expected, although computing its value is much more challenging. Indeed, as we saw, this geometric identity can be traced back to the buckling of beams established by Euler, but this equation should really include a numerical factor. The value of this factor will depend on the anchoring conditions, on the way the force is distributed, and on the shape of the sections. Trees are not exactly ideal poles, and the details of their geometry would also generate corrections on how their volume omega depends on the measurements of height and radius. Usually, the radius is measured at breast height, but the trunk does not have a constant radius all the way up, and trees are not just trunks anyway. So the precise value of the correction delta 2 will depend on the type of tree. Unfortunately, we can't get into the details of this fascinating problem here. For now, we'll just remark that if we put everything into a scaling between height and radius at breast height, we do get a numerical prefactor, which we can call delta, and which could very well end up with a mean value around 0.34, as on this plot. So the shape of trees could conceivably be understood in this way, as connected to the elastic modulus sigma and the weight density psi. Maybe we'll return to this scaling another time to see that this historic approach can actually be challenged, or at least refined, by considering the resistance to wind or the flow of water in trees. But before we abandon this rich example, we must underline that from within the dynamical paradigm adopted in this series, this scaling is not mechanically complete. Only one length is expressed mechanically, the hidden length. So we only have 2 out of 3 mechanical quantities. But we have enough to know where the third quantity could be. First, since we are dealing solely with geometry and not with kinematics, the third quantity should be on the same line. Moreover, if what we seek is a geometry where the height is proportional to the radius to the power 2/3, there can only be 2 possibilities. Either the third quantity is a force on the right, or it is an unnamed quantity on the left, which we shall just call Q here. It is on the left of the quantity we used when discussing cells. So either we have this trio, or this one. Indeed, only these 2 trios provide the adequate geometric identity, where a first length is proportional to a second length to the power 2/3, and where the cubic root of the simple length connecting an elastic modulus and a force density provides the proportionality factor. Recalling what we saw with cells, we see that we could favor one trio over another if we knew how the heights of trees, or their radii, depend on the elastic modulus of the wood, or on the force density, and hence on the wood density. For instance, considering the first trio would imply that the radius of a tree is inversely correlated to its elastic modulus sigma. Stiffer trees would be thinner, softer trees would be thicker. We leave it to you to assess if this prediction is correct, or if the second model would be more judicious. In that case, we invite you to propose interpretations for the third quantity q. Please let us know what you find in the comments. We wish we could say more now, but this episode is already quite long, and to be honest, we haven't properly done our homework on the mechanics behind the wonderful diversity of geometries displayed by trees, and more generally by plants. We hope that we have conveyed how trios of horizontally aligned mechanical quantities can be used to rationalize shape and structure, but we are conscious of the fact that a lot of work still remains to be done to fully test these mechanical models of geometry. The examples of cells on substrates with different rigidities, and now trees, provide the sketch of a program of research that goes beyond this series. We call on you to contribute. The mathematical framework is quite simple. Given 3 horizontally aligned quantities in the mechanical plane, we get 3 simple lengths in the kinematic plane, connected by a geometric identity. If we know the mechanics, we know the geometry. But in practice, we often have to work the other way around, by inference, by playing a game of mechanical bingo. Anywhere you can find that some length is proportional to some power alpha of a second length, then if alpha is not equal to 1, dimensional analysis implies that the coefficient of proportionality is connected to a third length, raised to the power 1 minus alpha. That much is clear. It is this kind of geometric identity that begs to be mechanized. The difference between this equation and this one is just a matter of reshuffling and relabeling. We invite you to do this translation exercise yourself, while being cautious to distinguish whether alpha is greater or smaller than 1. When the only thing we have at our disposal is a geometric identity like this, everything remains to be done, because none of the lengths have yet been connected to mechanics. Examples abound. For instance, by searching the literature, we found an intriguing case with a quartic identity. An identity like this can be rationalized by 2 kinds of configurations in the mechanical plane. We can also represent these 2 cases with a single sketch if we do not specify the orientation of the mechanical plane. The example we found concerns the relationship between the volumes of gray matter and white matter in brains of animals of different sizes. It has been found that the volume of white matter is proportional to the volume of gray matter to the power 4/3, divided by the typical thickness h of the cortex. Rearranging and introducing the characteristic sizes of gray and white matter, we get an example of a 4-dimensional relationship. What kind of mechanical trio could produce such geometry? There are a priori a lot of possibilities. Let us know what you think in the comments. Choices are more constrained when one relevant mechanical quantity has been identified. We saw the case of cells on substrates, which provides a nice example. There are many more like it to investigate. We also found a lot of situations where an identity like this has been observed, and where one of the 3 lengths is expressed fully mechanically. That is, when 2 of the 3 mechanical quantities are known. We discussed the case of trees. When 2 mechanical quantities have been identified, the choice for the third is restricted to just 2 possibilities. Only observations can help identify the valid option. We invite you to reflect on this case, and we also suggest you consider the following examples that we found in the book on capillary and wetting phenomena by Degennes, Brochard, and Quéré. That's 5 more examples in just one book, so you can imagine how many of these equations are out there. All these equations are similar to the one we discussed in the context of trees. A first length is a power law of a second, and the coefficient of proportionality involves a pair of mechanical quantities on the same line. For trees, the first length was the height, and the second the radius of the trunk at breast height. The stress sigma and the force density psi were respectively the elastic modulus of the wood and the weight density. The second equation is Durin's law. It is introduced on page 51 in Degennes' book. Durin's law governs the rise of fluids in capillaries. The first length is the height, the second is the radius of the capillary. Psi is the weight density of the fluid, and gamma its surface tension. So the third length is the hidden length, which is the so-called capillary length, which we saw on a few occasions since we introduced it in episode 2. With this length, Jourens' law can be recast to adopt the standard form we've defined in this episode. The capillary length is the geometric mean of the height and radius. There are two possibilities for the third mechanical quantity, hiding behind its geometric disguise. We'll let you figure out which ones they are. The third equation concerns a dynamical meniscus. The shape of the meniscus on a plate being slowly dragged out of a liquid. The first length is the height of the junction between the static meniscus and the liquid film on the plate, with a thickness giving the second length. The third length is again the capillary length. We'll let you think about which third mechanical quantity is behind this geometry. The next equation is found in the context of the Johnson, Kendall, and Roberts test, where one measures the radius of contact between a sphere with a given radius and a plane made of the same material. Sigma is the elastic modulus of the material, and gamma is the adhesion energy per unit area between the sphere and the plane. What is the third mechanical quantity? Note that if the sphere is pushed down with a force F significantly larger than the adhesion force, we get another example called Hertz's law. The next example concerns ascending thin films. It gives the thickness of the film as a function of the height. It depends on the weight density psi, and the energy E is the so-called Hamaker constant for thin fluids governed by van der Waals interactions. Finally, the last example is again found in the case of thin films governed by van der Waals interactions. It gives the scaling of the so-called healing length. When a thin film of thickness, L2 covers a solid substrate with small height variations. The healing length L1 gives the wavelength of the substrate's variations, over which the film adopts the profile of the substrate, and under which the film heals the variations, smoothing them out. Alright, we'll stop here for today because we already have a lot to play with. When we talked about horizontally aligned pairs in episode 2, we ended up with an episode that was an hour long, so now that we are discussing horizontally aligned trios, it's no wonder that there is a lot to cover. We'll return to this rich topic in the next episode. Thanks for watching.